great, man. Why you make me up? I wanted to sleep like one more hour or something, man. Y'all gotta chill. All right. Well, since I'm awake, I guess we'll just start our class period. All right. Give me just a second. Okay. So, if you remember, we are currently studying the book of Acts, which talks about the beginning of the church. And if you remember, the church more specifically started on the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came down and there were the tongues of flame on top of the apostles' heads, and also this rushing wind that came through and they began speaking all the languages, right? So that was the birth of the church, of the early church. And after that started, these incredible things were happening. The apostles were working miracles. And I should mention, in case you forgot, so apostles are kind of like disciples, right? Disciples are followers of Jesus, but apostles are sent out for a very specific task. Okay, so they're not just followers, but they're sent out with a specific task. And so the apostles are working all these miracles, and it's a very exciting time. And they're also sharing all of what they have together. And no person needed anything. Which is remarkable to think about. Because that's definitely not the case today, right? There are still plenty of people who have need. But this time they had it to the point where nobody in their presence had any need. And we hear this incredible story of this man named Joseph, also known as Barnabas, or the son of encouragement. And Joseph, he sells his house, his property, in order to give enough money to help those needs. And so he sells it, he gives the money to the apostles, they distribute it out, and he gives that whole thing. And it's this incredible example for us of really what we should do, that we should sell what we have if somebody doesn't have enough. But then, after that, we hear this story that is not quite as nice. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And that's the story that you learned about last class period. If you haven't done that, please go back, finish that, then come to this video, because otherwise this isn't going to make a ton of sense. And so Ananias and Sapphira, right, they also sell their possessions, and they're getting ready to give it to the poor, give it to the apostles to hand out. But instead of handing it all over, what do? They just took a little bit away just for some safekeeping. They're like, oh, we'll just tell them that we sold it all, but we can pocket a little bit, keep it down in here. Nobody needs to really know. Because that way we can look pretty good, right? Like we're giving everything, but we're also still, got a little bit on the side to spend up whatever we need, okay? And so when they do that, though, a pretty crazy thing happens. If you remember, both of them end up dying. That seems super intense. Why in the world do they need to die? Now, the story doesn't actually technically tell us whether God kills them or whether they just die. And so we don't quite know exactly, but obviously there was something going on because Peter predicted that this was going to happen. And here's why I think that story is there. First of all, because it shows us that the consequence of sin is always death. It just naturally is, okay? If we are living in sin, sin makes death happen, all right? When we're in Jesus, it means we have new life. It means that we get to live for eternity. But because of sin, we now have to deal with death. And so it's just part of the consequence. Sin leads to death. But the other thing is that I think this was a special time in the history of the church. It had just started. Because the reality is, if we all died for our sin and for telling lies, guess what? None of us would be alive right now. I guarantee you, every one of us at some point in our life has told a lie. And so we'd all be dead like Ananias and Sapphira. So why didn't it happen to us? Why did it happen to them? Like I said, I think it's because it was a specific time in the church. They had just started. And God, right, wanted to make sure that they had an example in Joseph of what you're supposed to do, but also to have an example of what is not okay. You can't lie to God, and you can't try to tuck stuff away for yourself when somebody else has needs around you, all right? And so he's trying to say very clearly through this example in this story that sin leads to death. So don't play with it, okay? So like I said, now that doesn't continue to be the case. We only see that example, but it serves as an example for us today. Even if we might not die, it's still so important to make sure that we are seeking Jesus and asking for that forgiveness of sin to live a different way. Okay? Now, so this is one of the problems that's happening inside the church, even though it's exciting. All right? And so we call these internal problems or internal pressures. They're on the inside. And so the internal pressure is greed. It's greed. They're trying to keep money for themselves. They don't want to give everything over to Jesus. They don't want to surrender it all. They want to hold on to some of them, their own stuff, and hold on to themselves. But the reality is that a life lived following Jesus requires everything of us. We need to surrender it all, okay, and to follow him. And so there's this internal pressure of greed that's happening. But then there were also external pressures, which means outside pressures, outside problems. And the outside problem was what's called persecution. Persecution. Now, I think we've talked about this before, but in case we haven't, let me first of all spell it. Persecution. Persecution. And what persecution means is dying for your belief, what you believe in. People are actually sometimes killed for things that they really firmly believe in. And today we're going to see an example of a story where a certain man who is a follower of Jesus is persecuted. He is harmed and eventually even killed for what it is that he believes. I really hope that this story is an example for you of what it looks like to really live that life that is fully surrendered to Jesus. And I hope that it really gives you inspiration, okay? Because to see someone who is willing to go all the way to the point of death for their faith, that's an incredibly hard thing to do. And we've discussed it before, whether we would be ready to do that. And my prayer is that as you hear this story and as you see just how deeply this man believed in Jesus and was willing to go to the point of death for him, that inside of you, the Spirit might also work up that sort of courage and that sort of faith. Now, that's not something we can achieve ourselves. That's a gift from God. And we're going to hear that this man was filled with the Spirit and was filled with God's grace. And it's okay if you're not there yet, okay? We're all growing in our faith. But my hope is that by this story, that the Spirit will grow that faith in you and give you the courage to really live fully and completely for Jesus, whatever that means. All right. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.